Welcome to Washington Today for Friday, February 11th, 2022. I'm Nkoyo Iyamba. Ontario's premier declared a state of emergency Friday in reaction to the truck blockades in Ottawa and at the U.S. border. Since Monday, scores of drivers protesting Canada's COVID-19 restrictions and venting their rage against Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have bottled up the Ambassador Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, Michigan. We'll hear more from Wall Street Journal reporter Vipal Monga at the U.S.-Canadian border. Britain's defense secretary visited Moscow Friday in another effort to ease tensions over a possible invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Ben Wallace's trip came a day after British Foreign Secretary Liz Truss held frosty negotiations in Moscow to urge Russia to pull back over 100,000 troops near Ukraine. We'll get an update from Politico's Alex Ward. The U.S. military mission to evacuate American citizens and foreign allies from Afghanistan was hampered by continuous appeals for help from an array of advocates, including White House officials, members of Congress, veterans of the war, media outlets, and even the Vatican. That's according to the operation's senior commander. Rear Admiral Peter Vasily called the outreach a, quote, distraction that created competition for already stressed resources. His comments appear in sworn testimony provided for a U.S. Army investigation of the August 26th suicide bombing that killed an estimated 170 Afghan civilians and 13 U.S. service members outside Kabul's international airport. We begin in the White House James Brady briefing room, where National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan briefed reporters.
Thanks, everybody, for giving me the opportunity to be here. I'd like to make a few comments on the situation in Russia and Ukraine, and then I'd be happy to take your questions. We continue to see signs of Russian escalation, including new forces arriving at the Ukrainian border. As we've said before, we are in the window when an invasion could begin at any time, should Vladimir Putin decide to order it. I will not comment on the details of our intelligence information, but I do want to be clear. It could begin during the Olympics, despite a lot of speculation that it would only happen after the Olympics. As we've said before, we are ready either way. We are ready to continue results-oriented diplomacy that addresses the security concerns of the United States, Russia, and Europe, consistent with our values and with the principle of reciprocity. We've continued to make that clear to Russia in close coordination with our European allies and partners. We are also ready to respond decisively alongside those allies and partners should Russia choose to take military action. Our response would include severe economic sanctions, with similar packages imposed by the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and other countries. It would also include changes to NATO and American force posture along the eastern flank of NATO, and it would include continued support to Ukraine. The President held a secure video conference today with key allies and partners to coordinate our approach to this crisis. The participants were the UK, France, Germany, Italy, Canada, Poland, Romania, the Secretary General of NATO, and the Presidents of the European Union. We have achieved a remarkable level of unity and common purpose, from the broad strategy down to the technical details. If Russia proceeds, its long-term power and influence will be diminished, not enhanced, by an invasion. It will face a more determined transatlantic community. It will have to make more concessions to China. It will face massive pressure on its economy and export controls that will erode its defense industrial base.
Reporters also asked National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan about the messaging of the Biden administration and other allies over the possible invasion of Ukraine.
What is your sense if Putin does decide to invade Ukraine? Is he looking to invade and take over the entire country, or a part like Crimea in 2014? And just one follow-up as well. How do you explain the disconnect between the rhetoric that we're hearing, or the warnings we're hearing from you and other Western countries, and what seems to be a playing down of the risk from Ukraine itself?
So I won't speak to the decisions that the Ukrainian leadership is making in terms of how they're communicating on this issue. I will only say that we are coordinating extremely closely with them. President Biden has spoken multiple times with President Zelensky. I speak nearly every day with senior aides to President Zelensky. Secretary Blinken is deeply engaged with both his counterpart and the president in Kyiv. So we will continue that level of coordination, sharing of information across every dimension of our government. But I can't characterize why it is that they're choosing their course. I can only say that based on the information we have, we've chosen to be as transparent as possible with what we see as a significant risk of military action in Ukraine. And as to your other question, I can't obviously predict what the exact shape or scope of the military action will be. As I said before, it could take a variety of forms. It could be more limited, it could be more expansive, but there are very real possibilities that it will involve the seizure of a significant amount of territory in Ukraine and the seizure of major cities, including the capital city.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan also responded to questions about providing intelligence on the situation involved in Russia's possible invasion of Ukraine.
Because this is getting so close now, and the concern that you're weighing towards the American people, is there a need to provide some underlying evidence of just what you're seeing that shows Americans this is a country that went through Iraq, and concerns about what the intelligence is showing? Does the administration see a need to just provide underlying intelligence?
Well, let me just start with a fundamental distinction between the situation in Iraq and the situation today. In the situation in Iraq, intelligence was used and deployed from this very podium to start a war. We are trying to stop a war, to prevent a war, to avert a war. And all we can do is come here before you in good faith and share everything that we know to the best of our ability while protecting sources and methods so we continue to get the access to intelligence we need. But there's another big difference between what happened in 2003 and what's happening in 2022. And that is, in that case, it was information about intentions, about hidden things, stuff that couldn't be seen. Today, we are talking about more than 100,000 Russian troops amassed along the Ukrainian border with every capacity out there in the open for people to see. It's all over social media. It's all over your news sites. So you can believe your own eyes that the Russians have put in place the capabilities to conduct a massive military operation against Ukraine, should they choose to do so. And then finally, I would just say, if you look at the course of the past few months, as we have said, we predict there will be a buildup of this kind. Our information is telling us that the Russians are likely to move in these ways. Thus far, in November, in December, in January, that has borne out. So I think when you take all of that together, we put forward a credible case. But it's not my job to stand up here and convince any of you of anything. It's your job to ask the questions and do what you can do. All I can do is, based on the best information I have available, that I can share, that the President can share, the Secretary of State can share, put that out there in close consultation with our allies and partners. That's what we've done.
At the White House press briefing, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan giving an update on the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. With us on the phone, national security reporter at Politico, Alex Ward. He has more insights into this situation. Now, is it a matter of if or when Russia invades Ukraine?
If you listen to Sullivan, he's still saying if. But however, his rhetoric changed a little bit to say Putin has not made a final decision on invading Ukraine. That's a bit different from before when the U.S. was saying a decision. So it seems to indicate at the moment the administration and perhaps Western allies feel that Putin is leaning toward that decision. And you did hear Secretary of State Antony Blinken today say that Russia could invade even before the Olympics end, which means if the Olympics end in 9 days, we have just about a week before Putin potentially sends tanks rolling into Ukraine.
So is it fair to say then that Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to be playing chicken with the international community on possibly invading Ukraine?
I think chicken's a bit strong. I mean, he clearly does seem to have differences with the European security architecture and wants that changed. And he was trying to see if he could get any concession. He's not, and so he's moving forward, it looks like, from the moment, with the military option. And then the U.S. and Western allies will, if that invade does proceed, which could include aerial bombings, missile strikes, cyber attacks before the actual sort of physical, troops moving in with tanks, et cetera, then you'll see those sanctions likely imposed in a collective way on Russia.
And obviously, we haven't heard from Vladimir Putin giving information as to if or when he will invade Ukraine. So what is the impact of that having on U.S. foreign policy?
Well, he has the world a bit hostage, right? Where he has the world's attention on him, what he will do, what he might not do. Having multiple world leaders go to Moscow and willing to chat with him about ways to de-escalate the crisis. But it looks like, based on what he has said, what his aides have said, he's not satisfied with Western responses. And frankly, it was always hard to believe that he would be, because he had asked for these maximalist positions that the West was never going to give him in at least a short amount of time. Maybe after many months of negotiations, they could have come to some sort of deal. So it was, if anything, perhaps a Hail Mary pass by Putin to go, hey, maybe I get something here without having to invade. Doesn't look like he's going to get it. And current indications are, while never guaranteed, but current indications are we will see another war between Russia and Ukraine, but this one far more enhanced and bloody than the one from 2014. And in a nutshell, please give us a brief description of what it was that he wants right now. What Putin would like is to see Ukraine never enter NATO, the alliance stop expanding, basically less Western unity on a whole host of issues. The West was saying, no way, we want countries to be able to join the alliance if they want to. We want to open up the West to those who want to join. And Ukraine has been moving further westward. Putin's unhappy about that and tried multiple options to get that to stop. It hasn't, and so now it looks like he's going to go for the ultimate option. And we're reading that the Biden administration is hoping to release a national security strategy, but this move or this inaction from Vladimir Putin is preventing that. Yeah, I mean, having Russia invade Ukraine completely changes the global threat picture and, frankly, shifts U.S. strategy. So putting out a document that would not include a full invasion of Ukraine, if that's what we see, would then automatically be obsolete. So they're holding on it, in effect, just to see what happens. And if something does happen, then it will change the underlying assumptions of the document. Alex Ward is a national security reporter at Politico. Find his reporting at politico.com. Alex Ward, is the world ready for Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine? They say they are. I mean, at the moment, what we're going to get if Russia does invade is a massive, pretty, world historic sanctions package that is going to do tons of damage to the Russian economy, a lot of damage to the European economy, some damage to the American economy, and then a broader effect on the global economy. And people would suffer from that, but of course they will suffer because the Russians decided to invade Ukraine, and this was the way the West tried to deter Putin. And if he's not deterred, then he's going to face the punishment. Now, is there going to be a way to stop Putin, to get him to stop the invasion? They're going to try. The West is going to try to basically send as much military aid and military equipment as they can. But the assessments are that if Russia really goes for it, there's very little anyone can do to stop them from taking at least a large chunk of eastern Ukraine, and if not even decapitate the government and replace one in Kyiv. And what heads of state are on Vladimir Putin's side, on Russia's side? It's hard to know. I mean, other than we know for a fact Chinese President Xi Jinping has shown that he is willing to back Putin, that he appreciated his general stance on this entire issue, right? The notion of no more NATO expansion and this Western move by Ukraine and other nations. So he clearly has China on his side. There are other friendly world leaders to Putin, including one awkwardly in the European Union, Viktor Orban of Hungary. But it's hard to imagine that Orban would be the lone voice in saying what Putin is doing is right while still being a member of the European Union, though it is not impossible for him. But the big worry here is that it's basically Russia backed by China against the U.S. backed by a host of Western nations. National security reporter at Politico, Alex Ward. Find his reporting at politico.com. Thank you so much for your insight, Alex Ward. Yeah, thanks for having me. You're listening to Washington Today.
Do you believe in miracles? That's the famous call from America's ice hockey victory over the Soviets in the 1980 Winter Olympics. Politicians still talk about America's win over the Soviets that year, and then winning the gold medal. Now the Winter Olympic Games are back, but talking about 1980 never left. As we'll hear in the latest, The Weekly.
I'm Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, and I am honored to represent New York's 21st Congressional District, the cradle of the American Revolution. It's where almost 250 years ago, brave patriots fought in the battles of Saratoga to turn the tide of the Revolutionary War. It's where 40 years ago in Lake Placid, a team of amateur hockey players out-hustled, out-skated, and defeated the Soviet Union, stunning the world and giving us the unforgettable Miracle on Ice.
Do you believe in podcasts? Yes! C-SPAN's The Weekly. Find it and follow wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back. This is Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio. I'm Nkoyo Iyamba with more headlines. President Joe Biden signed an order Friday to free $7 billion in frozen Afghan assets to split the money between humanitarian aid for poverty-stricken Afghanistan and a fund for September 11th victims who are still seeking relief for the terror attacks that killed thousands. President Biden's order calls for banks to provide $3.5 billion of the frozen amount to a trust fund for distribution through humanitarian groups for Afghan relief and basic needs. The other $3.5 billion would stay in the U.S. to finance payments from lawsuits by U.S. victims of terrorism that are still working their way through the courts. International funding to Afghanistan was suspended, and billions of dollars of the country's assets abroad, mostly in the United States, were frozen after the Taliban took control of the country in August as the U.S. military withdrew. Pfizer-BioNTech is postponing its request with the Food and Drug Administration to expand the use of its 2-dose COVID-19 vaccine for kids under age 5. NBC News reporting that Pfizer said it'll wait for its data on a 3-dose series of the vaccine because it believes 3 doses may provide a higher level of protection for this age group. Data on the 3rd dose is expected in early April. A federal cybersecurity agency is reviewing a report that alleges security vulnerabilities in voting machines used by Georgia and other states. The agency says the document should not be made public until officials have had time to assess and mitigate potential risks. Meanwhile, the report has been under seal since July in federal court in Atlanta, part of a long-running lawsuit challenging Georgia's voting machines. The author of the report, J. Alex Halderman, said in sworn declarations filed publicly with the court that he examined the Dominion voting system machines for 12 weeks and identified, quote, multiple severe security flaws that would allow bad actors to install malicious software. Find the full story at apnews.com. We begin in Canada, where hundreds of truckers protesting Canada's vaccine mandates have paralyzed the flow of goods and services at a bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan. It's also disrupting the auto industry on both sides of the border. The Ambassador Bridge is the busiest U.S.-Canadian border crossing, carrying 25% of all trade between the countries. Along with the economic toll, political pressure to reopen the bridge is mounting. The Biden administration has urged Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government to end the blockade, and Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer likewise called for a quick resolution to the standoff. Now, today's White House press briefing, Press Secretary Jen Psaki spoke about President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau's phone call earlier.
Today, Prime Minister Trudeau was obviously part of the planned meeting as well. He also had a separate meeting with him where they discussed the ongoing blockade of key bridges and crossings between the United States and Canada, including Detroit-Windsor, Sweetwater, Coutts and Pembina Emerson. The two leaders agreed that the actions of the individuals who are obstructing travel and commerce between our two countries are having significant direct impacts on citizens' lives and livelihoods. The president expressed his concern that United States companies and workers are experiencing serious effects, including slowdowns in production, shortened work hours, and plant closures. The prime minister promised quick action in enforcing the law, and the president thanked him for the steps he and other Canadian authorities are taking to restore the open passage of bridges to the United States. In turn, the Prime Minister also thanked the President and his administration, the Governor of Michigan, and U.S. officials for all of the assistance that we have provided to resolve the disruption, and the two leaders agreed to stay in close touch. In terms of this weekend, I just wanted you to have that component, another important thing happening right now.
White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki speaking earlier. Early Friday morning, Ontario declared a state of emergency amid the ongoing trucker protests. The Premier, Doug Ford, announced his declaration during a news conference and said those who impede the movement of goods, people, and services will face a fine of $100,000 and a year in jail. Premier Ford said the world is watching the ongoing standoff in his province and declared that the ongoing blockade is not what, quote, Canada is about. President Joe Biden has urged the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to use federal powers to end the blockade of truckers protesting COVID-19 restrictions, as the demonstration is reportedly resulting in $1 billion worth of losses each day it drags on. President Biden's call to action comes as the protests have spread beyond the capital in Ottawa to border crossings into the U.S., including the Emerson Port of Entry in Manitoba. Here is Prime Minister Justin Trudeau earlier today speaking at a press conference in Ottawa.
Obviously, the concern that we're facing on the borders is significant. We're seeing 6 different auto plants have to shut down over the past days because of lack of parts flowing across the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. We're seeing supply chains disrupted out west because of the Coutts border crossing and in Ontario because of the Windsor crossing. These are things that we are absolutely taking extremely seriously, but we have been taking the situation seriously from the very beginning and working with partners, municipal and federal, to put an end to these peacefully and responsibly. That is the job of police officers and police forces. The responsibility of politicians is to ensure that the police forces have the tools and the resources they need, and that's what we've been doing. But we do not direct the local police of jurisdiction, even when they're in proximity to an international border crossing. We all work together, and quite frankly, regardless of the conversations being going on between jurisdictions, I can assure you that on the ground, the actual cohesion and alignment with all different police forces, federal, provincial, and municipal, has been exemplary.
Follow-up? What did President Biden tell you about the U.S. influence or participation in the Canadian protests, and how was cut off any foreign funding?
Obviously, President Biden expressed his concern for the well-being of Canadians and indeed for the jobs and economic ties that flow back and forth across our border every single day. He expressed concern not just for the impacts right now, but the indication that there is international support from the United States and from elsewhere around the world for these protests. We've seen that the attack, for example, on the Ottawa 911 system came from the United States. We see that almost half of the funding through certain portals that is flowing to the barricaders here in Canada is coming from the United States. We see a mobilization of some of the more challenging political elements in Canada and in the United States around support for these blockades that are hurting citizens. We are going to continue to work together, as we have been, on resolving this situation, but also on strengthening our institutions and our democratic principles.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. What started as a local protest has escalated into a national emergency. That quote from the president of the Business Council of Canada, Goldie Hyder, that reporting from Vipal Monga, reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He's there at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Give us a big picture of what's happening right now.
About 50 trucks, most of them pickups, but 5 semi-trucks are sitting parked in front of the off-ramp of the busiest border crossing between Canada and the United States. They've blocked off all traffic and all trade for a point of entry that allows about $400 million worth of trade between the two countries to flow through every single day. All of that has ground to a stop.
And what are the implications of this? As I understand, this has escalated, according to Goldie Hyder, into a national emergency. What are the implications of this blockade?
So roughly 25% of all the trade between Canada and the United States comes through this crossing. What's happened is auto plants are starting to slow operations. Some of them have stopped second or third shifts. They've started to lay people off. It is a major crisis that is rippling through the entire economy and supply chains of both countries.
What does this mean politically, either for the U.S. and or Canada?
Well, for Canada, this has turned into a major crisis across all levels of government. Federal, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, provincial under Premier Doug Ford, and at the mayoral level here. Doesn't seem like anyone has been, until today, willing to take charge of this crisis. Until this morning, when the Premier of Ontario declared a state of emergency and threatened to imprison anyone who was blocking this entrance for a year if they continue to do so, and fine them as much as $100,000. He also threatened to seize their vehicles. So it seems like they've woken up to the fact that this can't go on any longer. It's been 5 days, and it's a massive headache. And in the United States, it's become such a big issue that Joe Biden has brought it up, and he's asked people like Transport Secretary Steve Buttigieg to talk to his counterparts in Ottawa to find some way for the federal government to resolve this impasse.
Are conservatives in America and they're in Canada raising money on this situation?
So there has been a pretty massive fundraising effort to go along with this. It initially started on a GoFundMe site, and they raised about $9 million to fund protests in places like Ottawa and now here in Windsor. That fundraising effort was shut down by GoFundMe and caused some controversy in states like Florida and Texas, where officials have said they threatened to investigate GoFundMe for closing down the fundraising efforts, basically stopping conservatives from raising money. Then there was a Christian site that opened its doors to fundraising efforts, and it raised several $1 million. And as of Thursday, those efforts have also been declared illegal in Ontario. There was a court injunction that was filed. But a lot of the funders are also turning to cryptocurrencies, such as Bitcoin, which are much harder to regulate. The flow of money seems to be coming along unimpeded.
What about Democrats and liberals in both countries, on both sides of the borders? What does this issue mean for them?
Well, I think there's been a lot of consternation on, the other side of the political spectrum, if you will, at the ability people have had, a relatively small number of people to grind, major economies to a halt just by parking their trucks in front of a bridge. And I think that's acted as a sort of a wake-up call. Another one, I guess, if you will, suggesting that, there's a lot of anger that is undergirding the movements, and none of that is going away anytime soon.
Vipal Monga, reporter at the Wall Street Journal, as you said, none of that is going away. And in fact, truckers have said that they plan to just come back. Have you heard that?
Yes. So a lot of them suggest that, they will leave if they're asked to leave by the police. I don't think there's any appetite for violence here, none at all, in fact. But they also understand that they've come to feel their strength, if you will, their power. And I think they are emboldened. And there's some sense that they can just come back and do this again if they want to. I'm not sure that that's necessarily a realistic view. I think there's some broader sense that authorities, once they realize the vulnerability here, will do everything they can to close that down. But again, I think they realize that just a few of them acting in concert can do a lot of damage and make their voices heard. So this is definitely emboldened them.
Vipal Monga, reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Find his reporting at WSJ.com. Thank you so much for giving us greater insight into this issue.
Great. Thanks so much for your time.
President Joe Biden seems to have narrowed his list of Supreme Court candidates to replace Justice Stephen Breyer once he retires at the end of this term. In an interview with NBC News Thursday, President Biden said the White House is doing, quote, a deep dive on 4 candidates to see if there's anything in their background that would disqualify them. The president made these comments after meeting with 10 Democratic members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Biden has said his nominee will be a black woman, and he will decide by the end of February. Finally, today, the White House hosted a Black History Month event, Thursday, that is honoring the Biden-Harris administration's historic number of black cabinet members. To celebrate President Biden's historically diverse cabinet, all 6 African-American members spoke about their life experiences. Those members include Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Michael Regan, UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield, Office of Management and Budget Acting Director Shalonda Young, Council of Economic Advisors Celia Roos, and moderator Cedric Richmond. He's the senior advisor to President Biden. Here's UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield.
Eventually was accepted into Louisiana State University after the university had a lawsuit that ordered the university to take more African Americans. And then I went through 4 years of suffering at that university. It's not a great thing to experience, to be somewhere where you're not wanted. But I look back on that experience and realize that that experience helped me build my adversity muscles that allowed me to move beyond that experience, see that experience as a positive one, despite the challenges that I faced. And I went on to graduate school, and like Secretary Austin, I had intended to go to law school. That was my goal. But I ended up in graduate school and got my first opportunity to travel to Africa when I was 26 years old, and the rest is history. I ended up meeting people who worked at the U.S. Embassy in Liberia, and 30 years later, I was the ambassador to Liberia. And when the president offered me this position, after I'd already spent 35 years in the Foreign Service, I'd retired, I was honored to come back and be his ambassador to the United Nations.
UN Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield speaking Thursday afternoon at the White House. A reminder that all of our coverage is online anytime at cspan.org. And if you missed any of this program, you can find it at cspan.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Also, if you'd like more on the stories that are shaping Washington, delivered daily right to your inbox, you can subscribe to C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Nkoyo Iyamba. Thanks for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Every day we take your calls live on the air on the news of the day, and we discuss policy issues that impact you. Coming up Saturday morning, we'll look at the effect that automation could have on the future workforce with James Pethokoukis, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and brothers Ty and Brock Benefill discuss their podcast, The Climate Pod. Watch Washington Journal live at 7 Eastern Saturday morning on C-SPAN or on C-SPAN Now, our new mobile app. Join the discussion with your phone calls, Facebook comments, texts, and tweets.